All right, Econ friends, welcome back to our next series of videos. Um, Up until now, we've been talking about macroeconomics and the data measurements. We've also talked about economic growth. We spoke about the business cycle, those ups and downs. So now we're going to evolve our discussion into more of the policy angle. We know that we have some economic instability that is shown in the business cycle. Those expansionary periods where things get too hot, we get some inflation, but also those contractionary periods, the recessions, where we're gonna have some unemployment, okay? So we have these problems, we know how to measure these problems. Now we're gonna evolve our discussion into some of the policies that the government has to try to address these problems. And in this lecture series, we're gonna be focusing specifically on money, the monetary system, and what is known as monetary policy. Okay, so let's jump in and let's start off with the very basic question. And that very basic question is, what is money? And while money means many things to many people, economists answer that question by saying this. To an economist, money is an asset that performs three basic functions. Okay, so money at its core is anything, to an economist, is anything that serves as an asset and can perform three basic functions. What are those functions? Well, number one, money serves as a medium of exchange. Function number one, money is a medium of exchange. What does this mean? Well, basically it means that money is used to buy and sell goods and services. This is one that we're all familiar with. We use money to buy things, to exchange, okay? That's its first function. This is really a very important function, and a lot of economic historians would argue that the invention of money is probably one of the most important inventions in all of human history. And to understand why, probably imagine a world without money. I mean, if you really want to understand the power and the role that money plays in your life, imagine a system without that. We would actually call that kind of system a barter economy. And a barter economy is an economic system where people have to directly trade or exchange one good for another. Clearly, if you think this through, you can see that a barter economy would be extremely inefficient. It'd be very difficult to determine what's worth what. There'd be huge transaction costs. There'd be a lot of issues. But fortunately, money, it simplifies this. Money reduces what we call the costs of transactions, the transaction costs. Without money, transaction costs would be exceedingly high. It would be very expensive to trade. And as a result of that, we would predict that gains from trade would be vastly reduced. And this goes back into one of our ideas from earlier lectures, the idea that people are made better off when they can exchange. That's the gains from trade. Money, in its first function, reduces transaction costs and allows more gains from trade by allowing more transactions to occur. Money's second function, through the eyes of an economist, is that money provides a standard unit of account. Money is a unit of account. What does that mean? Well, at its core, you can think of money basically as a unit of measurement. Anytime you're looking for a job, making a deal, figuring out if something is worth a certain other thing, you almost always put that in terms of money. So, for example, in America, dollars is a way to standardize our comparisons because we measure things in dollar terms. How much you make in your first job, how much you pay for your coffee, what a car is worth, how many hours of labor you have to sacrifice to obtain something. Dollars, or money in general, it allows us to have a standard unit of account. a systematic and consistent unit of measurement that allows people and firms to measure prices and also to keep track of revenues and costs. That level of consistency, that's money's second function, unit of account. And money's third function, money serves as a store of value. And what we mean by this is that at its core, money is a financial asset. And as a financial asset, people can use money as a place to put their savings. And if you have savings, you then have the power to delay spending today and buy more later. Or seen another way, money as a store of value, as a financial asset that you can use to park your savings, it allows you to transfer purchasing power from one period to a later period. If you imagine a barter economy or a really, really primitive economy without money, where people are only exchanging actual goods and services for each other, a lot of things would perish, a lot of things would spoil, things would go bad, things would go obsolete, and your value would be erased. Money, by serving as a store of value, gets rid of that. It allows us to delay spending today, to plan for the future, and to transfer purchasing power across time. In terms of financial jargon, we would refer to money specifically, cash, really specifically, as a liquid asset. Okay, liquid assets are defined as those that can be quickly and easily transformed into other goods. In fact, cash ultimately is pretty much the most liquid asset, because if you have cash in hand, you go somewhere to buy something, you can immediately transform those pieces of paper in your hand into goods and services, okay? One extension of this idea of store of value would be the question, well, if money is a store of value, what gives money its actual value? So we then kind of evolve into a discussion of the value of money. One way to think about this is that money's value is ultimately measured in terms of what it can buy. If you're going to think that money is a store of value, then the value of money is what stuff can you buy. Note that tied to an earlier discussion on the price level, money's store of value function can be hurt by inflation. Recall that inflation is an overall increase in the average price level, okay? Not the price increase in one or two items, but an increase in the overall average price level in an economy. Well, if you think about it and understand that an increase in the price level will reduce your purchasing power, you can see that inflation is detrimental to money's role as a store of value, okay? So we have three basic functions of money. One other thing to think about is what are the forms of money, and we believe that broadly speaking, we can classify money into either commodity money or what's called fiat money. Commodity money has an underlying value apart from its role as money, okay? So commodity money is a form of money that has other value apart from its money functions, okay? Historically, we have used commodity money throughout human history. Examples would include things like silver and gold. Those have actual fundamental uses outside of their money role. They took on the role of money because they were able to be exchanged. They took care of those three functions. But because they had underlying value, that's commodity money. More recently, we find that, for example, during wars and in prisoner of war camps, there have been emerging prisoner of war camp economies where actually cigarettes serve as money. They store value, they allow you to exchange, and they're a measurement unit. So they fulfill all three functions of money, and they function in prisoner of war camps as money, okay? And little known to many people, but very common in the ancient world, salt was a form of money. It fulfilled all three functions, so it was money, but because salt had underlying value apart from its money role, it was commodity money. One day you're going to go get a job, and when you get your job, you will earn a salary. The root of salary, sal, comes from the Latin for salt, which reflects salt's early function as commodity money. Okay, so this is our first form of money. Our second form is what we would call fiat money. This is really the money that you think of today, those coins and pieces of green paper in your pocket that you can exchange for things. Fiat money is not backed by any kind of commodity, and therefore fiat money has little or no underlying value outside of its money role. That leads to a really important question. If fiat money doesn't have any commodity-like value, what is the value of fiat money? Where does it derive its value? And there's a lot of debate among economists and thinkers on this, but among other factors, fiat money pulls value from what are called network externalities. Fancy way of saying that money derives value because all of us expect money to derive value. If I'm willing to pay you $20, a $20 bill for something, you'll accept that bill because you have faith that you can turn around and buy something else from somebody else with that. And they accept that $20 bill for the same reason. So there's this idea of network externalities. Money derives value in part, fiat money derives value in part because everybody believes that it has value and will accept it. Note that fiat money can also derive some of its value from the government. The government, for example, mandates that the US dollar is legal tender. It has to be accepted in this country to buy things. In fact, when you owe taxes to the government, they don't accept Bitcoin, they don't accept gold, they won't accept salt or cigarettes. You have to pay in US dollars. This mandate gives money status as a legal tender. And tied to that, fiat money typically also has the backing of the federal government, because it's the federal government, as we're going to learn later today, that backs up that value and in fact creates or at least influences that value. Okay? At its core, one important thing to think about is money, fiat money specifically, really at its core derives its value from trust. This thing, this green piece of paper has value because you trust that it has value and you trust that you can go on and exchange it for something else, which once again takes us back to those ideas of institutions. Good economic institutions, they foster trust. And we see the value of trust when we talk about fiat money. So now that we know what money is, the next question is to think about, okay, so where does money get its actual value? And I want you to think about money like any other commodity. And by that I mean that the main thing that makes money valuable is the very same thing that generates value for any other item. We learned this before. Value comes from the demand for a product relative to its supply. And therefore, at its core, the real value of money is based on the demand for money relative to the supply of money. You can think of money as a typical regular market, just like the markets for beer and nachos and oranges and all the other things that we've talked about, okay? If we think about money supply and money demand, the demand part is pretty easy. As we discussed earlier, people will demand money because it leads to convenience, it reduces transaction costs, it provides liquidity. So that's the demand for money. We want to buy and exchange things, we demand money. We want to have some in our pocket, in our bank account. Okay? The supply part is where money gets a little bit trickier. Okay? One big takeaway is this. If you think about the value of money as coming from supply and demand, and if you understand that purchasing power is important, you lead to this conclusion. If the purchasing power of money is to remain stable over time, its supply must be limited. This is crucial. An economy, we've talked about institutions and the idea of a stable money supply. Well, that's in large part because when you think about money as any other commodity that is governed by the laws of supply and demand, if an economy, if a country produces, prints, generates too much money, that excess supply is going to drive down the value like any other good. Okay, so we really believe, and this is a critical point, that from the supply lens, generally speaking, if we want our purchasing power to remain stable over time, the supply of money must be limited. We believe in economics that when the supply of money grows more rapidly than the output of goods and services, in other words, the economy is growing, it's producing more and more goods and services. That's the growth rate. If the supply of money grows faster than that growth rate, we believe that prices will rise and that money will become less valuable. Okay, this is a form of inflation. The old expression in economics is when you have this kind of situation, you have too many dollars chasing too few goods. If the money supply increases faster than the rate of output increases, you're going to have too much money chasing too few goods. And you know from supply and demand analysis that that is going to drive prices down. That's going to drive the value of money down because it's going to drive the prices of goods and services up. Okay? So big takeaway here, supply and demand dictate the value of money. We need to always have an eye on the stability of the money supply. Otherwise, we're going to get inflation, and that's going to be a major drop in the value of our money, which is going to violate one of money's big three functions. Okay? When we talk about the money supply, we go into a small little technical extension. There are three major measurements of money supply in the US. Okay? So we know that money's value comes from supply and demand. Got that part. We know the demand comes from consumers and businesses' needs for liquidity and to ease transaction costs. We know generally that the money supply is going to influence the value of money. So now let's dig a bit deeper into money supply. Okay? In the United States and in most industrial countries, we measure the money supply with three different metrics or three different terms, three different measurements. The first one we call M1. The M1 money supply is the sum of, number one, all cash in circulation, and this includes paper and coins, as well as checkable deposits, checking accounts held in banks, and traveler's checks. So the M1 money supply is composed of three things. All the cash in circulation, that one's easy, but also checkable deposits, which is the fancy name for demand deposits, aka checking accounts, which are held in banks, and traveler's checks. Those three things are M1. The M2 money supply, so now we go to M2. The M2 money supply, it equals M1, so you take M1 and then you add to it savings accounts, what are known as time deposits of less than $100,000, that's a form of a savings account that are held in banks, and what are called money market mutual fund shares. Those are some kind of arcane technical financial terms we can discuss during the lecture if you'd like, but just know this, M2 takes M1 and adds to it savings accounts, time deposits of less than $100,000 that are held at banks, and money market mutual fund shares. That takes us to M2. The third big measure of the size of the money supply is known as the monetary base. The monetary base is a measure of the money supply, and this includes cash that is held by the general public, so the cash that we hold, plus, and this is really critical for later technical points we're going to make, bank reserves. Banks have cash. Banks' cash is known as reserves. Banks can hold those reserves in several ways, including keeping it in their vaults, locked up in the back, or putting their reserves on hold at the Federal Reserve Bank, which we'll discuss shortly. Okay? When you take the cash that's held by the general public plus bank reserves, either in the vault or at the Fed, those two are the monetary base. Note that what the monetary base at its core represents are the purchases of financial assets and the extension of loans by the Federal Reserve. So in a way, the monetary base can be seen as the money supply that is influenced by governmental policy, is a way to see it, okay? You see a little chart here, and you can see up on this axis here, the value in terms of trillions of dollars. We have here the monetary base, the M1 supply and the M2 supply. You also have here some color coding that just gives you a sense both of what's included in each one and also what the values are. I think this was as of 2019. The numbers change all the time. You can look them up online. But the monetary base, again, consisting of bank reserves and currency, was valued at 3.9 trillion. M1 at 3.6 trillion. And of course, you can see that M2 significantly bigger than M1 because M2 adds in savings accounts, okay? So again, we have three basic measures: the monetary base, the M1 money supply, and the M2. The final thing for this quick discussion, this overview of money, in case there was any confusion, it's very important that you distinguish between money and credit. Credit cards are not money. I know that you can use them to buy things, so they have an exchange function, but there's a crucial reason why credit is not money. Money is defined as a financial asset. Asset is something that you hold that gives you value. Specifically, an asset can be used for future purchasing power. That's the key. Money is an asset, and as an asset, you own it, and it's going to give you, the holder, some future purchasing power. Credit, on the other hand, is not yours. Credit is funds, but it's funds that you acquire through borrowing, and therefore credit would not classify as an asset, but rather as a liability. Seen a different way, money, again, is an asset that gives you future buying power because you're going to have that money and transfer that value to buy to the future. Credit is a liability. In fact, what credit does, because it's money that you owe, you can really think about credit as reducing future purchasing power because you're going to have to pay that loan back sometime in the future. When you pay that loan back in the future, that's less money you have for actual purchases, okay? So just to be clear, money is money, credit is not. Thanks for your time on this. We'll continue on shortly. Thank you.